All right, welcome back. The issue of head injuries in professional sports is front and center again, with the filing of a lawsuit by the family of former NHL tough guy Derek Boogaard. The 28-year-old died 2 years ago after an overdose of painkillers and alcohol. His family contends the league is responsible for the brain damage and painkiller addiction. Joining us now is Layth Gafoor of sports and entertainment lawyer. Layth, thanks so much for chatting with us today.
Tom, it's always a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I don't think this is a reach, is it, to say that we saw a lawsuit coming at some point when it comes to the death of an NHL player or a former NHL player?
Well, Tom, I think this has pulled back the curtain and gives us a clearer backdrop of what happens to our heroes when they get carted off the ice or off the gridiron. It represents a story that has a backdrop that affects a very large amount of combative sports, so you're absolutely right, we saw it coming.
You mentioned the gridiron. Now, this is the first NHL lawsuit, but you were telling me earlier there are, what, hundreds of football lawsuits that have sort of come together?
Absolutely, Tom. So what we saw in the United States, I think the vanguards on this story are the NFL players or the former NFL players. So there were over 200 lawsuits separately filed throughout the United States, and all of those cases now represent about 4,200 former NFL players. And all of those are now being adjudicated under one large class action in Philadelphia. And essentially what the players are alleging is that the league had an obligation because, well, during the time that they were playing, they knew about these injuries and, more importantly, the impact that these injuries would have to them after they've retired.
Right. Okay. And the sheer numbers certainly point to the fact that we have a problem here, right? But you know, you got to say the athletes know what they're getting into, right? When they sign up for this, they spend their life trying to make it to the bigs, and when they do, they know what's involved. So what are the chances of families being successful here with a lawsuit?
Tom, the story really plays itself out in the court of public opinion. What should happen is, as a society, we elect a government that passes laws and courts that enforce those laws. But what happens is, the one point you made is one end of the argument, meaning that consent was given. Are these players not responsible for the decisions they make, right? They signed up for it.
Right.
But what's starting to happen now is, as a society, some of these public discussions about people's ability to consent to these levels of violence. I'll tell you one of the tough parts that's going to happen, that in the NFL lawsuit, the judges will look at not only were these individuals aware, but would they have actually opted out? So let's say I tell you that you're likely to suffer from post-traumatic or brain injury. Would those players have actually stopped playing? Mm-hmm. Were those injuries caused while they were in the NFL or in the NHL? Maybe they were caused in junior hockey. Maybe they were caused up in college. So I think the issue of consent is off the table in the sense that courts oftentimes will step in and say individuals cannot consent to certain levels of injuries, even though they're adults and they've consented to it.
Right. Okay, if we start involving society and we start involving governments in looking at this issue, ultimately we're going to see a change of rules, and when you change the rules, you run the risk of changing the game. So what happens to professional sports going forward?
Tom, I know where we are. We're on the eve of Game 7 of the biggest hockey game in this city we've seen in 10 years. But I like to say this. We have people that aren't hockey fans, and a lot of times they raise their opposition to the violent nature of the game.
And I think we really need to move past the, just shake that off and you'll be fine. And I think we have in most respects to what happens out there on the ice and the football field. But it really is a transition period for professional sports from the day of you'll be okay, shake that off, get back out there, as to what we have to do to monitor this.
Tom, you're absolutely right, and it goes all the way down. So all the viewers, all the mums and dads that have boys and girls participating in hockey, in basketball, in tennis, and lacrosse, like, this is a discussion that's happening right across sports. It takes us all the way from provincial PSO level sport all the way to national sports levels. Right. It affects mixed martial arts, and part of it is it's driven by the fact that we now have strong evidence about what concussions can lead to. Mm-hmm. And it will take time, Tom, to reverse our culture of shake it off to a point where we're starting now in minor hockey, where we are in junior levels of sports, where there are going to be some objective baselines that the organization and the coaches are required to take a look at, so that the players aren't feeling that pressure internally that comes about with, hey, coach, put me back on, I want to play. And I think that that's a responsible approach, and ultimately that NFL litigation When that gets settled, it will change the entire face of how we see combative sports. I suspect that this Derek's case may usher in a similar type of approach on the NHL side, finding former players, in particular the enforcers. And you'll know that in this case, they've particularized what Derek is responsible for because he had a particular role. So we know he played 6 years, 3 goals, but hundreds of hours in the penalty box. So it's these particular kind of individuals. And Derek's case is important because he also, they're looking specifically at the fact he was giving Toradol. He was given a lot of Oxycontin. In one case, the pleadings say he was given over 150 Oxycontin pills in 16 days.
Wow.
So it's a dramatic example of when something needs to change.
Layth, we're at the beginning of a very long conversation, and hopefully we'll chat about this again.
Thanks for having me, Tom. Anytime.